The dust had a taste. Clara knew it better than she knew bread. It was grit in her teeth, a film on her skin, and a constant hazy veil between her eyes and the pale, unforgiving sky. Late spring had come to this high, lonely patch of country, but it had brought no green. The drought held the land in a fist, choking the creek down to a muddy ribbon and baking the earth into cracked, gray hard pan. She was working the fence line, or what was left of it. The post in her hands was dry-rotted, splintered, and the wire was rusted thin. She was 34, but the land and the loss had carved decades into her face, leaving only the sharp lines of her jaw and the guarded, weary set of her mouth. Her hair, the color of dried corn silk, was pulled back so tight it ached at her temples. She worked alone. She always worked alone. The homestead was crumbling, not from neglect, but from the sheer impossibility of one woman holding back the wilderness. The barn, its new wood already graying, stood as a stark reminder of the fire that had taken her husband, Amos. 3 years prior, the house, small and square, hunkered low against the wind, its porch boards warped. Clara moved with a hard, practical anger. She set the post, tamping the dry earth around it with a heavy log, her breath hissing between her teeth. Every strike was a curse. She did not ask for help. She did not want company. She wanted only to be left with the silence, the work, and the aching peace of exhaustion at the end of the day. This isolation was her choosing. It was a fortress built of necessity. The nearest town, a sparse collection of wooden storefronts called Three Forks, was a half-day's ride, and she went only when she had to. The townfolk of Three Forks had judged her, and their judgment was as hard and dry as the land itself. Amos had been well-liked, a loud, easy-laughing man who bought rounds at the saloon and spoke of his wife with a proud, possessive air. When he died in the barn fire, a fire ruled accidental, a lantern kicked over in the hay, the town's sympathy had lasted barely a week. Then came the whispers. Clara, they said, had been too cold for a man like Amos, too quiet, too sharp-edged. She was seen mending the roof 2 days after the burial, her face set like stone. No tears, no proper womanly collapse. The whispers curdled into rumors. She was unfaithful, they hinted, though they could never name a man. She was cursed, they said, a woman who brought ruin. The most vicious rumor, spoken only by the hardest-faced women over their sewing, was that she had driven him to it, or worse, that she had not been as asleep as she claimed when the flames first caught. So, Clara kept to her land. She kept her heart locked tight as a winter pantry, and her mouth blunt. She survived on what she could raise, what she could shoot, and the bitter privacy she had earned. The next morning, the need for flour and salt drove her from her fortress. She hitched her old gray mare to the wagon, loaded the few dozen eggs she could spare and the jerky she had cured, and made the long, dusty ride. Three Forks was quiet. A few horses tied to the hitching rail outside the saloon. A dog sleeping in the shade of the general store's porch. When she stepped inside Huxley's general store, the low murmur of conversation stopped. Mr. Huxley, a thin man with a stained apron, nodded to her, his eyes sliding away. Mrs. Foster. Mr. Huxley, she said, her voice flat. She set the crate of eggs on the counter. Need flour, salt, and coffee, and I'll take what you'll give me for these. As he inspected the eggs, 2 women in dark calico dresses near the bolt goods aisle lowered their voices, but sound carried in the still, hot air. It doesn't seem right, her living out there alone, one whispered. It's unnatural. It's a judgment, the other replied. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Davies. Pride comes before the fall, and Amos, well, he was a saint to put up with her. Clara stared straight ahead, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. She felt the blood rise in her neck, a hot, familiar shame. She did not defend herself. To speak would be to show the wound, and she would rather die than show them where she bled. Huxley slid a small pouch of coins toward her, subtracting the cost of her goods. It was barely enough. He knew it. She knew it. "Drought's hard on everyone," he offered, a weak excuse. "It is," Clara said, bagging her flour. She turned, her boots heavy on the floorboards, and walked out. She did not look at the women. She did not look at anyone. She endured. She left the whispers behind her, but they followed her, clinging to her like the dust of the road. As she loaded her wagon, a man she did not recognize stepped out of the saloon. He was tall, and the first thing anyone would notice was the stillness he carried. He moved like a man who had learned not to waste an ounce of energy, nor make a sound he did not intend. He carried a worn saddle over one shoulder, his saddlebag slung over the other. A rifle was held easy in his left hand. He wore no revolver, or none that she could see. His face was lean, weathered by sun and wind, and marked by a pale scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone, disappearing into the rough line of his jaw. He looked tired, but not broken. He looked, Clara thought, like he had been walking for a very long time. This was Eli. He had arrived in Three Forks an hour before, not on a horse, but on his own 2 feet. His last mount had broken a leg in a gopher hole 50 miles south, and he had shot it, salvaged his gear, and walked. He stopped at the saloon, not for whiskey, but because it was the first door open. The barkeep looked him up and down. "Looking for work," Eli said. His voice was low, quiet, with a rasp of disuse. The barkeep polished a glass. "Ain't none." Eli nodded, his eyes scanning the few men playing cards in the corner. "Need work, anything, stable hand, mucking out." "Told you, mister, ain't nothing." A man at the bar, nursing a beer, turned. Suspicious times to be a stranger looking for work. Eli did not rise to the bait. He simply held the man's gaze, his own eyes dark and unreadable. The man looked away first. Eli tried the smithy. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man with sweat-slicked arms, just grunted and waved him off. He tried Huxley's, but Mr. Huxley took one look at the scar and the trail dust and shook his head before Eli even spoke. He returned to the saloon, defeated. He had enough coin for a plate of beans and a spot in the stable hayloft. As he ate, he listened. The men in town were suspicious. They didn't like drifters. They liked the world they knew. An old-timer at the end of the bar, seeing Eli was quiet and not looking for trouble, finally spoke. "You keep heading north. There's a place," the man said, his voice wheezy, "though I wouldn't recommend it." Eli waited. "The Foster place. Widow woman lives up there. Been alone 3 years since her husband burned." The old man tapped his temple. "Bitter, mean as a snake. Most folk think she's cursed, or maybe just crazy." He leaned closer. "They say she drove him to it. You ask me, a man's a fool to get tangled with a woman like that. Stay clear of the bitter widow, friend, unless you want that curse rubbing off on you." Eli finished his beans. He said nothing of curses. He had seen worse things than bitter widows. He had seen men who claimed to be blessed do things that would turn a buzzard's stomach. He paid the barkeep for the stable, took his saddle and rifle, and headed out back. He slept in the hayloft, the smell of dry hay and old manure a familiar comfort. He was asleep before the sun set, the deep, exhausted sleep of a man who had walked to the end of his rope. He woke to a sound he had almost forgotten. Rain. It was not a gentle spring shower. It was a deluge, a violent breaking of the sky. Thunder cracked overhead, sounding like the mountains themselves were splitting apart, and the rain came down in solid, gray sheets. It hammered on the stable roof, a deafening roar that lasted through the night. When dawn broke, the world was water. Eli stepped out of the barn into mud that sucked at his boots. The drought was broken, but the flood had come. The creek that ran south of town had jumped its banks, turning the main road into a churning brown river. He was trapped. He had no money for another night's lodging, even in the stable. The townsmen wanted him gone. He couldn't go south, so he went north. The old-timer had said her place was north. He figured the land would be higher up toward the canyons. He just wanted high ground, a place to wait out the water. He walked, the rain soaking him to the bone in minutes. His saddle heavy, the mud trying to claim his boots with every step. Clara was fighting the storm. The rain was a blessing and a curse. It filled her cistern, but it was also tearing her fragile world apart. A section of her chicken coop roof had collapsed, and now the main gate to the horse pasture had been ripped from its top hinge by the wind and the rushing water. She was out in the deluge, her oilskin slicker plastered to her body, her hair hanging in wet ropes. She was trying to drag the heavy, waterlogged gate back into place, to secure it with rope before her mare and the two geldings got spooked and ran. The mud was slick as grease. She slipped, falling hard to her knees. The gate slammed back against the post, the wood vibrating with the impact. "Damn it!" she screamed, her voice torn away by the wind. "Damn it all!" She pushed her wet hair from her eyes, her hands raw and shaking, and saw him. He was standing 20 yards away, just inside her fence line, where the road turned to mud, a tall shape in the gray rain. Saddle on his shoulder, rifle in his hand. Her heart seized. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through her. A drifter. A man. Here. "Get off my land!" she yelled, her voice breaking. "Get on! I got a shotgun inside!" Eli stood still, watching her. He didn't look threatening. He just looked soaked. His eyes went from her to the broken gate, to the rope slipping from her muddy hands. He said nothing. He started walking toward her. "I mean it!" Clara scrambled to her feet, backing away. "You take one more step." He didn't stop. He walked right past her, dropped his saddle and bags in the mud beside the fence, and laid his rifle carefully on top of them. He approached the gate. He was taller than Amos had been, leaner, but she could see the strength in his shoulders as he took hold of the wood. He looked at her, a quick, assessing glance. He was waiting. Clara stared, confused. He wasn't grabbing for her. He wasn't speaking. He was just waiting. She realized what he wanted. He couldn't lift the gate and tie it at the same time. Her anger warred with her need. The wind howled, pushing the gate again. If it broke free, the horses were gone. "Fine," she snapped. She grabbed the rope. He put his shoulder to the gate and lifted. It was a heavy, waterlogged thing, but he raised it with a low grunt, his boots sinking deep into the mud as he strained, holding it steady. The muscles in his neck corded. "Now," he said, just that one word. Clara's fingers fumbled with the wet, muddy rope. They were cold, clumsy. She tried to loop it, but it slipped. He held the weight, rain dripping from his hat, his face impassive. He didn't rush her. He didn't curse her. He just held the gate. She finally got the knot to catch. She pulled it tight, wrapping it 3 times, securing it. She yanked it hard, and it held. She stepped back, wiping her muddy hands on her slicker, breathing hard. Eli let the gate go, taking the pressure off his shoulder. He rolled his head, working the stiffness out. He looked at the gate, then at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the pounding rain. He had helped her. He had seen her struggle, and he had helped. This, more than any threat, set her teeth on edge. Pity was a thing she could not stand. He bent to retrieve his rifle, settling it in the crook of his arm. He picked up his saddlebags, slinging them, and then the heavy saddle. He was turning to leave, to walk back the way he came, into the flood. A strange, sharp panic hit her. It was the sudden, jarring realization of his stillness. He had been on her land, close enough to touch, and she had not felt the familiar, bristling danger she felt around other men. He was just quiet. But that made it worse. Quiet was unknown. Quiet was dangerous. He took 2 steps away. "Stay out of my kitchen," Clara snapped. the words sharp as broken glass. Eli stopped. He turned his head, looking back at her over his shoulder. The rain ran in rivulets down the scar on his cheek. She took a breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She had to set the boundaries, all of them. "You stay out of my kitchen," she repeated, her voice harder. "You stay out of my barn, and you stay clear of my damn fence line. You hear me? I don't need help. I don't want help." She was braced for an argument, for a sneer, a curse, or the pleading for shelter she dreaded. Eli just looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were dark gray, the color of the storm clouds. He gave one slow nod. Then he turned, and without another word, walked away from her, back into the rain and the mud, his shoulders set against the wind. Clara stood there until he was just a shape in the gray distance, and then gone. Her hands were shaking. She leaned against the gate he had fixed, the wet wood solid beneath her palms. That night, the storm finally moved east, leaving a cold, clear silence in its wake. Clara sat at her small kitchen table, eating a bowl of thin stew. The kitchen was her sanctuary, the one room in the house that felt entirely hers. Amos had hated her being in here, said it was his space to eat, not her space to work. Since his death, she had claimed it. The fire in the wood stove crackled, casting flickering shadows on the clean-scrubbed floor. She stared at the flames, her mind replaying the scene at the fence. She had screamed at him, she had threatened him, and he had just helped. He hadn't asked for payment, he hadn't asked for shelter, though he was soaked to the skin and looked like he hadn't eaten a full meal in a month. And when she had snarled at him, he had not snarled back, he had just nodded. It startled her, the calmness of him. It was a stillness she had never known in a man. Amos had been all noise and bluster. The men in town were all sly looks and loud opinions. This man, he was nothing. He was empty. Or perhaps, she thought, he was just full of a different kind of quiet. She found herself angry. Angry that he had fixed the gate. Angry that he had seen her fall. And angry that, for a fleeting second, she had felt not fear, but a strange, aching pull of recognition. Two drowned things in the same storm. She pushed the thought away. Finishing her stew, she was tired. She banked the fire, bolted the door, and went to her cold bed. Sleep did not come easy. When it finally did, it brought the dream. It was always the same, flickering, jagged pieces, the smell of kerosene and dry hay, the orange light pulsing against the barn walls. She was standing outside. The door bolted from the outside. Her hand was on the bolt. Then the sound, not a scream for help, an angry, roaring bellow. Her husband's voice. Not afraid, but furious. The sound of him throwing his weight against the thick wood. The splintering crash as he tried to break free. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The smell of smoke sharp in her nose. The house was cold. The fire was low. She was alone. She stared into the darkness, and for the first time in 3 years, the face she saw in the flames was not her husband's, it was the stranger's, his gray eyes steady in the rain. The supply wagon from the east was late. A week passed, then 2. The muddy tracks left by the great flood had dried and hardened into ruts, but the freighter did not come. Clara's world, built on a precarious edge, began to tilt. The coffee tin was empty. The sound of scraping the metal bottom echoed in the silent kitchen, loud as a gunshot. The flour sack, usually plump, lay nearly flat. She had salt, she had jerky, and she had the eggs from her hens, but she could not last without flour. The land demanded hard labor, and hard labor demanded bread. Going to town was a failure. It meant she was not self-sufficient. It meant exposing herself to the whispers and the stares. But the empty flour sack was a more immediate threat than pride. She hitched the mare, her movements sharp with anger. The ride to Three Forks was tense. She saw the full extent of the storm's damage. The fence line she and the stranger had mended with rope was a disaster. Posts were down, wire snapped. The pasture near the creek was a sodden marsh. The old irrigation ditch Amos had dug, poorly, now a silted-in mess. The water was pooling, drowning the good grass. She could not fix it alone. The realization sat in her stomach like a cold stone. 3 Forks was as she had left it. She tied the mare in front of Huxley's, her jaw set inside. The store was dim. "Wagons delayed." "Mister," Huxley said, not looking up from his ledger. "Heard they got held up by washouts near the divide. Could be another week. Prices are up." Clara's lips thinned. "I need flour. And coffee." "Got some flour left. Coffee's gone. 'Cept for the high-priced grounds I keep for the preacher." She paid the extortionate price. It took nearly all the coin she had. "I'll load it myself," she said, cutting off his offer of help. She went around to the side alley where the loading dock was. She was bracing herself to lift the heavy 50-pound sack when she saw him. Eli. He was not walking the roads. He was working. He was hauling crates of whiskey from Huxley's cellar and loading them onto a freight wagon bound for the northern mines. He moved with the same quiet, relentless pace she remembered, his shoulders straining under the weight, his face slick with sweat. He wore the same worn clothes, now caked with dust. She watched as he finished, and Huxley came out, counting 2 small coins into his palm, pennies. A slave's wage for an hour of back-breaking labor. Eli pocketed the coins, his face impassive. He turned, and his eyes met hers across the dusty alley. That same jolt, not of fear, but of recognition. A sudden, sharp awareness of his stillness in a loud, careless world. Clara stiffened, her hand going to the side of her wagon. She was an intruder here, watching him. 2 local men, loafers who spent their days leaning against the saloon wall, were watching from the shade. One of them, a man named Silas, known for his crude mouth and empty head, saw her. He pushed off the wall, a slow, unpleasant grin spreading across his face. "Well now," Silas drawled, loud enough for the alley to hear. "Look-a there, Tom, the bitter widow's come to town. What's the matter? Mrs. Foster? Land too much for you." Clara ignored him, turning to her wagon. Silas laughed, emboldened. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Watcha looking at widow? That drifter? He ain't much to look at, but I suppose he's all that's left for a woman like you." The other man, Tom, snickered. "Careful, Silas. You heard what Amos himself used to say. She's too much woman for most men." The cruelty of it, using her husband's own possessive words against her, struck Clara like a slap. The blood drained from her face, then rushed back, hot and painful. She gripped the wagon wheel, her knuckles white, bracing for the next blow. It never came. Eli had set his empty crate down. He did not say a word. He did not look at Clara. He simply turned and looked at Silas. It was not a threat. It was not anger. It was a cold, heavy emptiness. It was the absolute stillness of a rattlesnake before it strikes. It was the look of a man who had seen the bottom of the world and was not impressed by the petty cruelties of men like Silas. Silas's grin faltered. His laugh died in his throat. He shuffled his feet, suddenly finding the dust at his boots fascinating. Just making talk," he muttered. He nudged his friend. "Let's get a beer." The 2 of them scrambled away, disappearing into the saloon. The alley was silent. Clara was shaking. She was caught between a desire to flee and a strange, rooted paralysis. He had defended her. He had done it without a word, without a gesture, without even acknowledging her. Eli turned back to his work, picked up another crate as if nothing had happened, and loaded it. He finished the job, took his saddle and bedroll from against the wall, and looked at Huxley. Huxley nodded, eager to be rid of him. Eli started to walk away, heading north, back to the flooded road, back to nothing. Clara looked at the heavy sack of flour. She looked at her empty wagon bed. She thought of the drowned pasture and the miles of broken fence. She thought of the coming winter and the impossibility of doing it all. She hated herself for it. She hated the weakness, but the words came out, tight and sharp. You. Eli stopped. He turned. You're working for pennies. She said it was an accusation. He nodded once. Work is work. I have work, she said, the words tasting like alkali dust. My fence line is down. The storm wrecked it, and I need a new irrigation line dug from the creek bed to the pasture before it's ruined. He waited, his gray eyes steady. I can't pay coin. She gestured to the small sack she'd just bought. I can offer meals. You can sleep in the barn, not the house. She felt the need to add, nothing else. Eli looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the saloon where Silas had fled. He looked at the hard, dry hills north of town. Then he looked back at her. He saw the fury in her, and the desperation locked beneath it. I'll ride back with you, he said. The relief was so sharp, it felt like pain. Clara immediately buried it under a fresh layer of anger. She would not be weak. She would not be grateful. There are conditions, she said, her voice sharp as new wire, reclaiming her ground. Strict conditions. He waited. First, you don't ask about my past. You don't ask about him. She jerked her chin toward the road leading to her homestead, to the burnt patch of ground where the old barn had been. You don't ask me anything. You are here to fix the fence and dig the ditch. That is all. Eli nodded. Second, you don't stay past sundown. You do your work. You eat the meal I leave for you on the porch, and you sleep in the barn. When the work is done, you leave. Another nod. She took a hard breath, her eyes like chips of flint. This was the most important one. This was the boundary that kept her sane. And you never, ever step foot inside my kitchen. That door stays shut. That is my space. That is not for you. Understood? Understood, Eli said. His voice was quiet, a low rasp. He did not ask for help. He walked to her wagon, lifted the heavy sack of flour with one smooth motion, and settled it in the back. He placed his own meager belongings, the saddle, the rifle, the bedroll, beside it. He climbed in and sat, his back against the flour, his knees drawn up. Clara stared at him. She had expected him to argue, or to ride up front. He had simply obeyed. He had made himself small, made himself cargo. She climbed onto the driver's seat, her back ramrod straight, and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward. They rode out of Three Forks, the silence between them as vast and heavy as the high desert sky. The days fell into a strange, hard rhythm. Clara rose before dawn, the habit of grief and solitude ingrained in her. She lit the fire in her kitchen stove, made her coffee, and went out to the cold, gray light. She milked her one cow, fed the chickens, and gathered the eggs, her movements efficient and silent. By the time she was done, Eli was already working. He had started on the irrigation ditch. The ground was hard, packed clay mixed with stone, baked by the sun. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. All day, she heard the sound of it, the thud of the pickaxe, the scrape of the shovel. A steady, metronomic beat that was, she realized, the first human sound on her land, other than her own. In 3 years, she worked on her own tasks. She mended harness. She weeded her small, precious vegetable garden. She split wood. She worked with a frantic energy, as if to prove she did not need him, even as the sound of his labor echoed behind her. At midday, she would go inside. She would cut a thick slice of bread, add a piece of jerky or a hard-boiled egg, and put the tin plate on the porch's top step. She would pour a dipper of water into a cup and set it beside the plate. Then she would go back inside, her kitchen door shutting with a firm click. She watched through the small window over her dry sink. He would come up from the ditch, his face and arms streaked with dirt, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat. He would go to the pump, wash his hands and face, pumping the handle with slow, easy strokes. Then he would retrieve the plate and sit on the ground, his back against a porch post. He never sat on the porch itself. He ate slowly, his eyes on the horizon, never once looking toward the window where he must have known she was. When he was done, he would place the clean plate and cup back on the step and walk to the fence line. He would work there until sundown, pulling the old, rotted posts, digging new holes, his movements economical and strong. He spoke little. When she emerged in the morning, he would nod. "Ma'am." When the sun bled out behind the western cliffs, he would stop, gather his tools, and walk to the barn. "Evening, ma'am." She flinched at these small kindnesses. A ma'am from him felt different than from other men. It was not condescending. It was just polite. It was a politeness that asked for nothing in return. It unsettled her. She found herself watching him. She watched him with her mare, Daisy. The horse had a bad front leg, a lingering injury from the storm that had left her with a limp. Clara was practical. She knew the mare might never be fully sound again. One afternoon, she saw Eli at the pasture fence. He was not working. He was standing by the mare, his hand on her neck, rubbing the tense muscle. His voice was a low, gentle rumble, too quiet for Clara to hear the words, but the sound of it it was soft. The mare, usually skittish and head-shy since her injury, had her head lowered, her eyes half closed, leaning into his touch. Clara's throat tightened. Amos had had no patience for animals, just as he'd had no patience for her. He'd used the whip and the spur, and his voice had always been a sharp command or a furious curse. This gentle, quiet man in her yard was a contradiction. He was a drifter, a man with a scar, a man who silenced others with a look, and yet he spoke to a broken-down horse with a tenderness she had never witnessed. That night, she baked bread, the kitchen filled with the warm, yeasty smell. She cut her own slice, but found herself cutting a second one, an extra thick heel. The best part, she slathered it in the last of her butter. She left it on the porch rail, separate from his dinner plate, wrapped in a small, clean cloth. She did not watch him take it. She could not, it felt too much like an invitation. The next morning, the bread was gone. The cloth was folded neatly, weighted down by a small, smooth stone. The sight of him with the mare brought the memories back, sharp and unwelcome. They always came for her in the kitchen, the place she had made her fortress. Flashback. Amos had not been the man the town knew. The public Amos was loud, generous, his arms slung around her shoulders in a show of proud possession. The private Amos was a different man. The land had been hard. The first year, the crops failed. The second, a colt he'd paid too much for broke its leg. His pride, which was as vast and brittle as the dry plains, began to sour. It started with words. He'd sit at the kitchen table, the one she was now leaning against, and drink. "You're not much of a wife," he'd say, staring into his cup. "Quiet as a stone, and barren, to boot. I give you this house, this land, and you can't even give me a son." She learned not to answer. Silence was safer. But silence, too, became an offense. "What's the matter with you?" he would suddenly roar, slamming his fist on the table. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." He began to close doors. He didn't like her in town. "You're my wife," he'd say, his hand gripping her arm, his fingers digging in, leaving bruises she would hide under her long sleeves. "You smile for me. You don't need to be smiling at Mr. Huxley or that blacksmith. You belong here." The kitchen was his stage. He would sit, demanding, while she cooked, criticizing the food, her movements, the way she breathed. He would back her against the wall, his body blocking her escape, his voice a low, vicious whisper. "You're ruined. Clara, you know that, don't you? No one else would have you. You're lucky I keep you. Lucky I don't just cast you out. The night of the fire, he had been in a black rage, drunk, furious over a broken wagon axle. He'd grabbed her, shoved her hard against the kitchen wall. "You're a curse," he'd hissed, his breath hot and sour. "Everything I touch turns to rot because of you." He had grabbed the kerosene can and a lantern, stumbling toward the barn, still raving. "I'll fix the axle myself. Don't need a useless wife for that." She had followed him. She had stood in the cold night air, her heart a block of ice. She'd heard him stumbling in the hayloft, cursing. She'd seen the lantern waver wildly, and she had slid the heavy outer bolt on the barn door. She had stood there, her hand on the cold wood, shaking so violently she thought her teeth would crack. She heard the silence, then the confused shouting, then the pounding, the sound of his heavy body throwing itself against the door. And then, as the orange light began to pulse against the cracks in the wood, the first terrified, inhuman scream. And flashback. Clara gasped, gripping the edge of her dry sink. She was in her kitchen. She was safe. He was dead. She looked out the window. Eli was at the fence line, tamping a new post into the earth. He was steady. He was quiet. He was the opposite of Amos in every way. And he was here. The work on the ditch was almost done. The fence was half mended. Weeks had passed. The air had shifted, the dry heat of summer giving way to the first hints of autumn. One evening, the sky turned a sick, bruised purple. The air went heavy and still. A familiar, ominous quiet fell over the land. Clara, coming in from the chicken coop, saw Eli looking at the western horizon. "Storm's coming," she said, her voice tight. "A bad one," he agreed. The air was electric. Thunder rumbled, a low growl from far away. "You should secure the animals," she said, unable to meet his eyes. "Already did," he said. He had moved the mare and the geldings into the small, sheltered corral by the barn. "Check the roof on the barn. It'll hold." The storm hit like a fist. The wind came first, a high-pitched shriek, followed by sheets of rain that turned instantly to hail. It hammered the roof, a deafening, violent roar. Clara was in her kitchen. She lit a lamp, but the wind threatened to pull the flame up the chimney. She paced from the window to the stove. She looked out into the black, churning chaos. Eli had made a run for it. Not to the house, but to the barn. He had disappeared inside just as the worst of it hit. "He was in the barn. The place Amos died." The storm raged. The wind sounded like a woman screaming. The house creaked and groaned, protesting the assault. Clara sat at her kitchen table, her hands clenched in her lap. He was out there, in the dark, in the barn. It was what they agreed. He had a roof. He had dry hay. He was a grown man. He was not her concern. But the memory of the fire was thick in her throat. A choking smoke. The sound of the wind was the sound of a man pounding on a locked door. She stood and walked to the window, staring at the black, invisible shape of the barn. The house was warm. The kitchen was her safe, bolted place. She thought of his quiet, his steady work, the way he had silenced Silas, the way he spoke to her mare, the neatly folded cloth on her porch rail. She could just open the door. She could let him sit on the porch, under the eaves. He wouldn't even have to come inside, just out of the worst of the wind. Her hand went to the latch on the kitchen door. Her fingers touched the cool iron. "Don't be a fool. Clara, kindness is a trap. He's a man. All men want something. Amos wanted your spirit. What does this one want?" She snatched her hand back. She would not be weak. She would not be soft. Softness was what got you bruised. Softness was what got you cornered in your own kitchen. She turned from the window, blew out the lamp, and went to her cold bed. She lay awake for hours, rigid, listening to the thunder and the hammering rain, and the echoes of a scream she would never forget. Dawn broke, cold and wet. The storm had passed, leaving the world battered, soaked, but blessedly clean. Clara rose, her body stiff, her conscience a dull ache. She felt a knot of shame low in her stomach. She had left him out there. She built the fire, her hands clumsy. She put the coffee pot on to boil. The smell filled the small room. She went to the window, dreading what she would see. He was already working. He was not at the barn. He was at the new irrigation ditch. He was soaked to the bone, his thin coat plastered to his back. Mud caked his boots and trousers. He was clearing debris, branches and rocks that the storm had washed into the newly dug channel. His movements were stiff with cold. He had not come to the house. He had not banged on the door, begging for shelter. He had not complained. He had honored their agreement, even in a gale. And he was working, though he must be half frozen. Clara stared, a hard, dry knot of certainty inside her. The certainty that all men were the same, that all kindness was a lie, began to crack. She turned from the window. She took her own tin mug from the shelf. It was warm from the stove. She poured it full of hot, black coffee. She unbolted the kitchen door. She opened it. The cold, clean air hit her face. She stepped out onto the porch. He did not hear her over the sound of the shovel. "Eli," she said. Her voice sounded strange in the open air. He stopped, shovel half full. He turned slowly, his movements wooden. He looked at her, his face pale with cold, the scar on his cheek standing out starkly. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. Clara held out the mug. She said nothing. She did not know what to say. She just held it out. He walked toward her, his boots squelching in the thick mud. He stopped at the edge of the porch, not stepping onto the wood. He looked at the steaming mug, then at her face. His gray eyes were impossible to read. He reached up a muddy, half-frozen hand and took the mug. His cold fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second. Clara pulled her hand back as if she had been stung. He wrapped both his hands around the warm tin, a violent shudder passing through him. He lifted the mug and drank, his eyes closing for just a moment. The relief was plain on his face. He drank all of it, fast, chasing the heat. He handed the empty mug back to her. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low, hoarse rasp. It's just coffee," Clara stammered, already backing toward the door, her fortress. He looked at her, his gaze steady, and she could not look away. "No, ma'am," he said, very quietly. "It ain't." He turned, picked up his shovel, and walked back to the ditch. Clara fled. She hurried inside, shutting the kitchen door, sliding the bolt home. She leaned against the wood, the empty mug clutched to her chest. She could still feel the cold from his fingers, a strange, electric tingle. She was trembling. The drought broke, but summer came on like a fever. The sun, which had once been a pale, distant enemy, was now a brassy, relentless force. It bleached the grass to straw and baked the new mud back into iron. The world was reduced to shades of yellow and brown, and the sky was a painful, cloudless blue. The irrigation ditch was dug. The fence line was, for the most part, mended. The work Eli had been hired for was done. Clara knew this, Eli knew this, and still, he stayed. She did not tell him to go. He did not ask to stay. A new, unspoken bargain was struck, day by day. He moved from the ditch to the homestead itself. "The roof on the north side is rotting," he said one morning, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the sagging shingles. "That's why your ceiling plaster is cracked. It'll cave in this winter." Clara had looked up. "I know." "I can fix it," he said. And so, he was on her roof. The sound of his hammer, measured and steady, became a part of the long, hot days. It was a sound that should have felt like an intrusion, but instead, it sounded like, "Holding on, it sounded like the opposite of crumbling. When the roof was done, he pointed to the window in the main room, the one Amos had broken in a rage and she had patched with oiled paper. "Glass will hold the heat better. I can get a pane in town. Charge it to my own account at Huxley's." "You have an account?" she asked, startled. "Huxley's paying me in credit for the hauling I did. A few dollars." She gave a stiff nod. She could not argue with the logic. So, he was inside her house. He was in the main room, a small, dark space that held her bed, her sewing chair, and the cold fireplace. He worked with a quiet precision, chipping out the old, dried putty, setting the new pane of glass. Clara sat in her chair, pretending to mend a shirt, every nerve in her body aware of him. He was large in the small room. He did not smell of whiskey or stale tobacco, as Amos had. He smelled of pine soap and dust, and the faint, metallic scent of his tools. He did not whistle, he did not talk, he just worked. But the kitchen door remained shut. It was the boarder. He was allowed in the house, a guest, a repairman, but the kitchen was the heart. It was her territory, the place of her memories, the place of her sin. He did not approach it. He did not ask for his food to be brought inside. He still ate on the ground, his back to the porch post. One afternoon, the heat was a suffocating blanket. Clara was in her garden, her bonnet soaked with sweat, trying to coax water to the roots of her dying tomato plants. The air was dead still. Then she heard it, a low, soft sound. It was not a bird, it was a voice. She followed the sound to the corral. Eli was there, brushing her mare. Daisy, the horse's injured leg, was stronger, the limp almost gone. He was running the brush in long, slow strokes over the mare's flank, and he was humming. It was not a tune she recognized. It was simple, sad, and aimless, like a man thinking to himself. It was a sound of such profound, unguarded loneliness that it stopped Clara's breath. It was a sound so private. She felt like she was spying. Amos had hated singing, called it a fool's noise. The tenderness of the scene, the quiet man, the trusting animal, the sad, simple tune, it was too much. It was a crack in the wall. "You're wasting daylight, mister," she snapped. Her voice was sharp, ugly in the hot air. Eli's hand stilled. The humming stopped. He did not turn around for a long moment. When he did, his face was smooth, the mask back in place. "Just currying her, ma'am, gets the dust off." "She's a work animal, not a pet," Clara said, her words tight. "And you're wasting time you could be using to fix the trough." "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice flat. He put the brush away, his movements economical, and walked past her toward the trough, not meeting her eyes. Clara stood there, her heart pounding with a strange mix of shame and anger. She had spoiled something. She had taken a small, quiet moment and broken it. She turned and went back to her garden, her hands shaking. 2 days later, the need for salt and lamp oil drove her back to Three Forks. She rode in, bracing herself. She knew what she would find. The town had been watching. Her isolation, which had been a subject of pity and scorn, was now a subject of scandal. A widow, alone on her land, with a drifter. The whispers were no longer whispers. As she tied Daisy to the rail, she saw Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, standing on the steps of the church, watching her. Mrs. Davies marched across the street, her black dress cutting a sharp line in the dust. "Clara," she said. "No, Mrs. Foster, just Clara." It was the address of a woman about to be admonished. Clara straightened her spine. "Mrs. Davies." "The town is talking," Mrs. Davies said, her voice low and sharp. "They are saying you have taken that man into your home." "I have a hired hand," Clara said, her voice cold. "My land is my business." A hired hand who sleeps in your barn? A man with no name and a scar on his face? You are a widow. Clara, you have a reputation to consider. My reputation was decided by this town 3 years ago. Clara said, I have nothing left to lose. Mrs. Davies's face hardened. The false piety fell away, revealing the cold judgment beneath. You are wrong. You have your soul to lose. She stepped closer, her eyes like black beads. Listen to me. As a Christian woman, men like him, they are drifters. They are wind. They do not stay. They are tumbleweeds, and they bring only the dirt they roll in. He will use you, and he will leave you. And when he is gone, you will be worse than you were. You will be lower than Amos left you. The words struck home. A cold, sharp fear. It was exactly what Clara herself believed. Mrs. Davies saw the flicker in her eyes and pressed on. And women like you, she whispered, her voice laced with a terrible, final pity, are not meant to be redeemed. You made your choices. Do not compound your sin by dragging this man into it. Send him away, before it's too late. Clara's hand ached. She wanted to strike the smug, certain face. Instead, she drew herself up. You are not God, Mrs. Davies, and you are not welcome on my land or in my business. She turned, her back rigid, and walked into Huxley's, leaving the preacher's wife standing in the dust. But the words followed her. He will leave you. Women like you aren't meant to be redeemed. The ride home was long. The fear and the shame settled in, heavy and cold. Mrs. Davies was right. Of course she was right. What was Clara thinking? That this quiet man was different? That he saw something in her besides a convenient barn and 3 meals a day? She was a fool. A lonely, desperate fool. He would leave. The ditch was dug. The roof was mended. He would get restless. He would walk away, just as he had walked into her life, and she would be alone again. Only this time, the silence would be unbearable. She arrived back at the homestead as dusk was falling. A deep, bruised purple. She felt shaken, stripped raw. She unhitched the mare, her movements jerky. She was angry at him for being there, angry at herself for letting him stay. She walked to the house, ready to tell him, the work is done. You have to go tomorrow. She reached the porch and stopped. He was there, kneeling by the kitchen door. In the dim light, she saw he had a small tin of axle grease and a rag. He was working on the door's bottom hinge, the hinge that had squeaked a high, complaining whine. Every time she opened or closed it, every day for 3 years. A sound she had come to associate with her own trapped, aching heart. He was fixing it. He was touching her kitchen door. What are you doing? She snapped. Her voice was too loud, raw with the day's wounds. Eli looked up. Startled, he slowly rose to his feet. He was tall, and in the twilight, he seemed to block out the world. The hinge, ma'am, he said, his voice quiet. It was loud. I thought I'd quiet it for you. I didn't ask you to quiet it, she said, trembling. I didn't ask you to touch my door. I didn't ask you for anything. He stood perfectly still. He did not defend himself. He just watched her, his face in shadow. What do you want? She whispered, the words tearing out of her. It was the question that had been sitting under her breastbone for weeks. It was the question Mrs. Davies had put in her mouth. You fixed the ditch. You fixed the roof. You fixed the window. What are you still doing here? What do you want? She expected him to ask for money, for permanent work, for winter lodging. He was silent for a long time. The crickets started their nightly song. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face in the gloom. Not to leave, he said. It was so quiet, she almost missed it. It was not a request. It was a statement, simple, clear, and devastating. Clara's breath hitched. She had no defense for this. She had no sharp words. The foundation of her anger, the certainty that he was just using her, crumbled. She stared at him. He had fixed her fence, her roof, her window, her squeaking hinge. He had faced down Silas. He had hummed to her horse, and he did not want to leave. Her hand, which had been clenched at her side, went to the door latch. She opened the door. The hinge was silent. She stepped back into the darkness of her kitchen. "In," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "For a minute, just past the threshold." Eli did not move for a second. Then he bent, picked up the grease tin and the rag, and set them carefully on the porch. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He took one step, then another, crossing the threshold, and stood just inside her kitchen. The room was almost black. The only light came from the open door, outlining him, casting his long shadow across the floor. He was in her kitchen. He had broken the one rule, and she had let him. They stood in silence. The air was thick, charged with all the things they had never said. She could smell the grease on his hands and the clean scent of the pine soap. He was breathing slowly, deeply. She was barely breathing at all. This was the room where Amos had terrorized her. This was the room where she had hidden and wept and planned. And now, this quiet, scarred man was standing in it, not as a threat, but as an answer. The tension was a living thing. It was a wire pulled taut between them. She wanted to scream at him to get out. She wanted to bolt the door and trap him inside. She wanted to touch the scar on his face. "Good night, ma'am," he said, his low voice breaking the spell. He stepped back, out of the light, onto the porch. Clara slammed the door. The sound was a violation. She slid the bolt home, her hands shaking. She leaned against the wood, her eyes wide in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Eli stood on the porch for a long time, looking at the door. Then he turned and walked to the barn, the hinge silent as a shadow. Later that night, he lay awake in the hayloft, the memory of her kitchen, the faint smell of wood smoke and dried herbs, still in his nose. He had crossed a line. He knew it. He hadn't meant to. He just heard the squeak. It was a sound of something broken, and he knew how to fix broken things. He rolled onto his back, staring up into the darkness. He blamed himself for things. He was good at it. It was, perhaps, the only thing he was good at besides fixing what was broken. His mind drifted, as it always did, back to his brother, Ben. Flashback. Ben was 20, all laughter and quick, flashing smiles. He was too trusting, and he fell in with the wrong crowd. Eli was older, quieter. He was supposed to be the sensible one. He was supposed to be watching out for Ben. But Eli was gone, working a cattle drive south to Texas. When he got back, Ben was in the town jail, accused of stealing a horse from Judge Thorne himself. "I didn't do it, Eli," Ben had said, his hands gripping the bars, his eyes wide with terror. "I swear to God, I was with them, but I didn't ride the horse. I told them not to." "I know," Eli said. "I'll talk to the judge. I'll make it right." But he didn't. He went to the saloon first. He thought he'd gauge the town's mood. He had one drink, then two, trying to build his courage. He was not a fighter. He was not a talker. He was just Eli. By the time he got to the judge's house, it was too late. A posse, drunk and righteous, had dragged Ben from the jail. Eli ran. He ran to the big cottonwood tree by the river. He saw the torchlight. He heard them. He heard Ben screaming his name. "Eli! Eli, help me! Don't let them!" Eli hid in the shadows. He was one man against 12. He had his rifle, but he was frozen. He was a coward. He watched, his hand over his mouth, as they threw the rope over the branch. He watched as his brother, his laughing, trusting younger brother, kicked against the empty air. He had not stopped it. He'd buried Ben himself the next morning. Then he had walked away. He had been drifting ever in. He'd drifted into the war, and drifted out. He'd drifted from one ranch to another. He'd taken the scar on his face in a bar fight he hadn't started, but had been too tired and full of guilt to avoid. He was a man defined by what he had failed to do. End flashback. He closed his eyes in the hayloft. He understood Clara. He understood her fortress. He knew what it was like to be haunted, to be called cursed by a world that didn't know the truth. He saw her pain, her brittle anger, and it was a reflection of his own. He didn't just want to fix her fence. He wanted to stand between her and the posse. He wanted to be the man he had not been for his brother. A week later, the tension between them was a constant, itchy thing. They avoided each other's eyes. Clara left his food on the porch and fled inside. He worked, his movements harder, faster, as if he were fighting something. One night, Clara went to the barn to get a jar of preserves she had stored in the cool earth under the floorboards. It was late. The moon was a pale sliver. She pulled the floorboard up and heard a sound, a low, wet panting. She froze. She peered into the darkness. In the far stall, she saw two pinpricks of light, eyes. "Eli," she called. No answer. She lit the lantern she carried. She held it high, her heart pounding. There, huddled in the hay, was a wild dog. A stray, its fur matted, its ribs sharp. One of its back legs was mangled, torn open and bleeding into the straw. Clara's first reaction was disgust. A wild dog. It could have rabies. It would kill her chickens. She backed out of the barn. Her mind set. She went to the woodshed and grabbed the shovel. It was a wounded, dangerous animal. It had to be put down. She walked back to the barn, her jaw set, the shovel heavy in her hand. "Ma'am." Eli's voice came from the darkness. He stepped out of the tack room, his bedroll in his hand. He had seen her light. He saw the shovel. He looked past her, into the stall. "Don't," he said. "It's vermin," Clara said, her voice shaking. "It's wounded. It's a mercy." "It's just hurt," he said. He walked past her, setting his bedroll down. He did not grab the shovel. He just walked toward the stall. The dog let out a low, terrified growl, dragging itself deeper into the hay. "Eli, don't," Clara warned. "It'll bite you." He paid her no mind. He knelt, his movements slow, his hands open and visible. "Easy now," he murmured, the same voice he had used on her mare. "Easy. I'm not gonna hurt you. Just let me see. Easy now." He was close enough to touch it. The dog snapped, its teeth clicking weakly, inches from his hand. He did not flinch. He just kept talking, a low, soothing monotone. He sat in the straw, a few feet from the animal. He sat there for a full minute, not moving, just talking. The dog's growling subsided, replaced by the same weak panting. Clara watched, frozen. Eli slowly reached his hand out. The dog trembled, but it did not snap. He laid his hand on its head, between its ears. "There now," he whispered. "See, it's all right." He gently ran his hand down its back, then to the mangled leg. The dog yelped, a high, thin sound. "Shh, shh, I know," he said. "I know." He looked back at Clara. "I need water, and a clean rag, if you have one, and that grease you keep for the wagon." Clara stood there, holding the shovel like a fool. She was watching a man cradle a dying, dirty animal as if it were a child. She was watching his hands, the same calloused, strong hands that had dug her ditch and mended her roof, be impossibly gentle. Something inside her that she had thought was dead. Something buried deeper than Amos, deeper than the fire, stirred. It was a hot, painful lurch in her chest. She dropped the shovel. The clang made the dog start, but Eli calmed it. She turned and ran to the house, to the kitchen, her hands fumbling with the latch. She grabbed a strip of clean linen she'd been saving for mending, her water bucket, and the tin of grease. When she got back, he had the dog cradled in his lap, its head resting on his thigh. He was cleaning the wound, his touch methodical. He packed the grease into it, and then bound it with the linen, his knots quick and sure. When he was done, he just sat there, stroking the animal's head. Clara stood in the lamplight, her heart aching. She had been ready to kill it. He had wanted to save it. The next day, the dam broke. She was angry. She was furious. At him, at the dog, at Mrs. Davies, at herself. He had no right to be so good. He had no right to come to her ruined land and show her what kindness looked like. It was a threat. It was a weakness she could not afford. She found him by the corral, reinforcing the gate he had first fixed. "The dog will bring wolves," she said, her voice flat. "It's in the tack room. It's quiet," he said, not looking up. "It will die. You're just drawing it out." "Maybe," he said, testing the post. "Or maybe it'll live." "And then what? You'll keep it as a pet? It's a wild thing. It doesn't belong here." He finally stopped. He turned to her. "And what about us? Clara, do we belong here?" He had used her name, not ma'am. Clara. The sound of it, spoken in his low, quiet voice, undid her. "Stop it!" she screamed. The word ripped out of her. "Just stop it. Stop fixing things. Stop fixing my roof and my hinge. And that dog, you're not fixing anything." He took a step toward her. "I'm not trying to—" "Yes, you are," she cried, backing away. "You think I'm like your dog? A stray to be mended? You think you can just come here and fix me? You can't fix me just because you're good at fixing things." The accusation hung in the hot, dusty air. He stepped close. His face was, for the first time, full of a raw, visible emotion. It was not anger. It was a deep, profound sadness. It was the face of the man who had hummed to her horse. "Clara," he said again, his voice rough. He was too close. She could feel the heat from his body. She could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the texture of the scar. He was going to touch her. He was going to save her, and she could not bear it. She reacted. It was pure, blind panic. She slapped him. Her hand across his face. The sound was sharp, shocking, a crack in the stillness. They both froze. The world stopped. His head was turned, his cheek bright red where she had struck him. He slowly turned his head back to her. His eyes were not angry. They were wounded. He looked at her with a pain that mirrored her own so perfectly. She thought she would break apart. She had hurt him. She, who had only ever been hurt, had struck him. "Oh, God," she whispered. Her hand tingled, alive with the awful contact. She didn't know what she was doing. Her body moved on its own. She grabbed the front of his shirt. She pulled him down. She was going to kiss him. She was going to erase the blow. She rose on her toes, her eyes fixed on his mouth. She saw his eyes close. He was letting her. The scent of him, the heat, the surrender. It terrified her. She let go. She shoved him, hard. She sobbed, a dry, tearing sound. And she ran like the barn was on fire. She ran to the house, to the one place she was safe. She fumbled with the kitchen door, threw herself inside, and slammed it shut, sliding the heavy bolt into place. Eli stood alone in the yard, his hand slowly rising to his stinging cheek. He did not move. He did not follow. He just stood there, listening to the sound of her bolt sliding home. The bolt on the kitchen door slid home, was a short, thick line of black iron. It was the only thing in the world Clara trusted. For 3 days, she did not speak to him. For 3 days, she lived inside her fortress, the kitchen, and the small, dark bedroom off of it. The silence was a sickness, a thick, choking dust that settled on every surface. She kept to her new routine. She rose in the dark, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She would peek through the window. He was already up, sitting by the barn, staring at the eastern line of the sky, his back to her. He was waiting. She would prepare his food, bread, a tin of cold beans, and open the kitchen door just wide enough to slide the plate onto the porch. By the time she had pulled the door shut and slid the bolt, he would be walking, not to the porch, but to the fence line, to work. He would fetch the plate later, when he was sure she was not watching. He did not approach the house. He did not ask for orders. He just worked. He split the last of the dry logs, stacking them in a neat, precise wall against the side of the house. He reinforced the corral. He even took a bucket and began to whitewash the side of the barn, the new wood that had replaced the burnt. His labor was a silent question she refused to answer. The homestead, which had just begun to feel mended, started to suffer. The work was too much for two people who were not speaking, and far too much for one. The horses grew restless in the corral. Sensing the tension, they paced, their tails lashing. Eli's dog, the stray he had named Patch, would not leave the barn. It lay in the hay, its mended leg healing, its eyes tracking Clara whenever she came near, a low, uncertain whine in its throat. And the sky began to change. The heat did not break. It held, suffocating. But the air grew thick, the light turning a strange, sickly yellow. The horizon, which was usually a sharp, clear line, grew hazy, then blurred, as if a dirty thumb had smudged it. A dust storm was looming. It was coming from the south, a great, dark wall of prairie dirt that was still days away, but its breath was already on them. The yellow light made the world look diseased. It pressed on Clara's nerves, amplifying the silence, making the bolt on her door feel thin and useless. On the fourth day, she saw the lamp oil can was nearly empty. The wicks were burned low. If the storm hit, she would be trapped in darkness. The thought, combined with the memory of the cellar and the howling wind, created a sharp, sudden panic. She had to go to town. She hitched the wagon, her movements jerky. She did not look at Eli, though she knew he was watching her from the woodpile. She rode away, the yellow sky pressing down, the air tasting of metal. Three Forks was battening down. Men were boarding up windows, and Huxley was tying canvas over the barrels on his porch. The street was empty, save for two men she did not recognize. Strangers, drinking whiskey on the saloon porch at 10 in the morning. Clara hurried into the store. Mr. Huxley, his face grim, was counting lamp wicks. "Storm's gonna be a bad one. Mrs. Foster," he said, his voice tight. "Coming up from the panhandle. They say it'll blow for 3 days." "I need oil," she said, "and wicks, and flour, if you have any." Last sack, everyone stocking up. As he wrapped the wicks, the two strangers from the porch sauntered in. They were not from this country. They wore long dusters, despite the heat, and their guns were tied low. They looked hard, mean, and bored. One of them, a man with a scarred lip, picked up an apple and spoke to Huxley. "You seen a drifter pass through?" Tall man, scar on his left cheek, answers to Eli. Eli Stone. Clara froze. Her back was to them, but her hand stopped, hovering over her purse. Huxley shook his head. "We get drifters." "This one's special," said the other man. Younger, his voice a lazy drawl. "He's wanted, horse theft, down in Texas, Judge Thorne's prize stallion." "That's right," the first man said, his voice oily. "Stole the horse right out of the judge's barn. Man who'd do that is bold or stupid. And there's a $100 reward for him." Huxley's eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the northern road, toward Clara's land. He quickly looked down. "Haven't seen him." "Well, you keep an eye out," the scarred man said. He threw the apple, unpaid for, onto the counter. "We're riding north. Heard he might be working a homestead up that way. $100 is a lot of money for a drifter's head." They turned and walked out, their spurs ringing on the floorboards. Clara stood, her blood turned to ice, A liar, a horse thief, a wanted man. Mrs. Davies's words came back to her. Men like him don't stay. They are tumbleweeds. She had been a fool. She had let a common thief into her yard, into her house. She had almost kissed him. The shame was so hot, it burned her throat. She had slapped him for getting too close, and all along he was a criminal, hiding. He was just like Amos. He was a lie. She paid Huxley, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the coins. She did not meet the storekeeper's eyes. He knew. He must have known. He, and the whole town, were watching her play the fool to a wanted man. She rode the wagon back at a dangerous pace, the yellow sky forgotten, her mind consumed by a cold, white rage. She was not angry at the men. She was not angry at Huxley. She was furious with Eli. But beneath that, a deeper, colder fury was aimed at herself. She had let herself hope. She had let herself feel something other than anger. And she had been betrayed. She saw him as she rode in. He was at the corral, trying to calm the horses, who were spooked by the strange, dead air. Clara pulled the wagon to a halt, the wheels skidding. She did not get down. She sat on the seat, high above him, her face a mask of stone. "You're a liar," she said. Her voice was flat, dead. Eli stopped. He turned to her, his hand still on Daisy's neck. The wind was picking up, a low, rising moan. It whipped strands of her hair loose from her bun. "Ma'am." "Do not call me ma'am," she said, her voice rising. "You are a thief, a wanted man. Eli Stone, wanted for horse theft." He did not look surprised. He did not look ashamed. He just watched her. His face, which had been so full of pain when she slapped him, was now closed. It was the face of the man who had stared down Silas. "I didn't steal that horse," he said, his voice quiet, lost in the wind. "Oh, you didn't," she cried, her voice breaking with hysteria. "So, the men in town, the bounty hunters, they're just wrong? They're here. Eli, they're looking for you. $100. Is that what you were waiting for? For them to come here, to bring them to my land?" "No, I didn't know they were here. I was just—" "You were just what?" she screamed, finally climbing down from the wagon. She was shaking from head to toe. "You were just hiding? You let me take you in. You let me feed you. You let me trust you." That was the word she had not admitted to herself. Trust. "Trusted me?" he said, and for the first time, his voice had an edge. It was as sharp and cold as her own. "You haven't trusted me for 1 second since I got here. You bolted your door. You looked at me like I was vermin. You slapped me for getting too close. You lied to me." "I did not lie," he shot back, his voice rising over the wind. "I didn't say, that's not lying. It's just surviving. Same as you." "Do not compare yourself to me. You are a thief." He took a step toward her, his face dark with a sudden, matching anger. "My brother was hanged for that horse. He didn't steal it either. Judge Thorne is a corrupt, cruel man, and he wanted someone to pay. Ben was young. He was weak, and I wasn't there to stop them." He stopped, his chest heaving, the confession torn out of him. Clara stared, her own anger faltering, confused, but the shame, the wound of her own foolishness, was too deep. That's just a story. You're trying to—" "I am not trying to do anything," he said, his voice going quiet again, but with a new, dangerous weight. "I am just like you. Clara, I've got a past I'm running from. I've got walls I've built. We both do." He gestured to the house, to her kitchen. "You're right," he said. "I should have left, but I stayed. I stayed because I looked at you and I saw me. I saw someone who was haunted. But I was wrong. You don't want to be fixed. You want to be angry." "Get off my land," she whispered, her eyes burning. "Fine," he nodded. "I'll get my things." "No, now, get out! I don't want you here when they come." He looked at her, and his face was full of a terrible, quiet pity. "You think I'm the one you're afraid of?" He took a step toward her. She backed away, her hand flying to her mouth. "You see," he said, his voice low and sad. "You bolt that door every night. You stand behind that window. You think I haven't seen you. You're afraid of me. You're afraid of every man." "I am not afraid," she cried. "No," he said, and his voice was so soft, it cut deeper than a yell. "Not of me, not really." He looked past her, at the kitchen door, the black iron bolt she had just left. "You stay out of your kitchen," he said, the words dropping like stones into the heavy, yellow air. "You hide in there, but you are not hiding from me. You are hiding from him." Clara gasped, as if he had struck her. "Him, Amos." "You stay out of your kitchen," Eli repeated, his eyes holding hers. "Not because of me, but because of him." The sky broke. It was not a sound. It was an absence. The wind, which had been rising, suddenly died. A complete, dead, heavy silence fell. The yellow light turned to greenish black. Eli looked up, his eyes widening in genuine fear. "Get inside," he said. "Do not tell me." "Not the house," he yelled, grabbing her arm. "The house won't stand it. The cellar. Now. Run!" A roar, a sound like 1,000 freight trains, coming from the south. It was not a storm. It was a wall, a solid black wall of dirt, 1,000 feet high, eating the world. The first gust hit them like a physical blow, throwing Clara off her feet. Dirt filled the air, not as dust, but as a grinding, stinging mass. It was instantly black. Day turned to midnight. "I cannot see," Clara screamed, choking, the grit filling her mouth, her nose. "My hand," Eli yelled. "Take my hand." She flailed, blind, terrified. His calloused hand found hers, clamped down like a steel trap. "This way, to the cellar." He dragged her. She stumbled, fell to her knees, but he did not let go. He hauled her up. The wind was not wind. It was a solid, moving thing. She heard a crack, a scream of wood, part of the chicken coop. "Here!" he roared. He fumbled with the heavy wooden doors of the root cellar, set at an angle into the ground. He yanked one open, the wood groaning. "Get in! Get down!" He shoved her, hard, into the black, earthy-smelling hole. She fell down the first few steps, landing hard on the dirt floor. Before she could cry out, he was in after her, pulling the heavy door shut against the impossible force of the wind. The door slammed. The world was gone. Total, absolute blackness. The sound, it was deafening. The wind was not howling. It was a deep, guttural, vibrating roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The ground beneath her was shaking. The cellar, a small hole lined with stone, was the only thing in the world. Clara was curled on the floor, her hands over her head, her body rigid with terror. She was choking, trying to cough the dirt from her lungs. She was not alone. She could hear him, breathing, a heavy, labored sound close to her. "Clara!" His voice came out of the dark, a rasp. She could not answer. She just shook. This was it. This was God's judgment. She had been warned. Women like you aren't meant to be redeemed. And now she would die in a hole in the ground, next to a wanted man. It is all right," he said, his voice closer. It is just wind. It will pass." "It will not pass," she sobbed, the words muffled. "It is the end." "No," he said, "it is just dirt." She felt a movement. He was shifting, his knee brushing her side. She flinched, scrambling back, hitting the cold stone wall. "Do not touch me!" "I am not," he said. "I am just sitting." The air is better on the floor." They sat in the roaring darkness. Time disappeared. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. The sound did not stop. It was the sound of the world being scoured clean, of mountains being torn down. Clara's terror began to fade, replaced by a strange, cold numbness. She was still shaking, but it was a deep, internal tremor. His words echoed in the dark, louder than the storm. "You are hiding from him." He was right. He was right. She had bolted the door against Amos, and she had never unbolted it. She had lived in that kitchen, her sanctuary, her prison, for 3 years, a ghost in her own house, terrified of the man who was already dead. He was not the man they thought," she said. Her voice was a whisper, so small she was not sure she had spoken. But Eli went still. His breathing stopped for a heartbeat. "What?" "In town," she said, the words coming out dry, cracked. "Amos, they thought he was a saint, a good man. He was not." The confession hung in the vibrating, earthy dark. "He was cruel," she whispered. Behind closed doors. When the crops failed, when he drank, he blamed me for everything, for the drought, for being barren. He hurt me." Eli said nothing. He just listened. His silence was a void, pulling the truth from her. "That night," she said, her voice shaking violently now. "The night of the fire, he was in a rage. He had been drinking. He hit me. He said he would end me. That if I was a curse, he would send me back to hell." She was sobbing, dry, choking sobs, the dust in her throat turning to mud. "He went to the barn. He was raving. I followed him. I was so afraid. I stood at the door. I heard him, stumbling, cursing, and I slid the bolt." The roar of the wind was the roar of the fire. The pounding on the cellar door was Amos, throwing his body against the wood. "I slid the bolt," she screamed, her voice cracking. I do not know. I do not know if I set the fire, or if he kicked the lantern. I do not. But I bolted the door. I stood there, and I listened. I listened to him. Realize, I listened to him scream. I did not just lose him. Eli, I freed myself." She collapsed, curling into a ball on the dirt floor, her body convulsed by the truth. "I killed him. I am what they say. I am a curse. I am—" Silence, the wind, her sobs. Then, movement. In the pitch black, she felt his hand, not grabbing, just searching. His calloused, rough fingers brushed her arm, her shoulder. Then they found her hand, the one she had clenched into a fist. He did not say, "It is all right." He did not say, "You did what you had to." He said nothing. He just took her hand, his fingers wrapped around hers, a warm, solid, living thing in the dead, dark earth. She did not pull away. She wept, her breath tearing at her chest. He shifted, closer. He did not let go of her hand. His other arm came around her, across her back. He pulled her, gently, against his side. He tucked her head against his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart under her ear, a counterpoint to the howling chaos outside. His arm was solid around her waist. He just held her. And for the first time since she had met Amos, she let him. She was not snapped. She was not brittle. She was broken, and she let him hold the pieces. The wind died at dawn. It did not fade. It just stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was as shocking as the noise. Clara was asleep, her body heavy against Eli's. He had not moved all night. He was stiff, his arm numb, but he had not let her go. She woke slowly, the silence pulling her from the darkness. She was warm. She was being held. She stiffened, the memory rushing back, the confession. His hand. It is quiet, she whispered. It is over, he said. His voice was a low rasp in his chest. He let go of her waist. She felt the loss of his heat immediately. He did not let go of her hand. We have to see, he said. He found the door. It was jammed. Dirt and debris were piled against it. Stand back, he said. She scrambled away. She heard him grunt, his shoulder hitting the wood. Once, twice, on the third try, the door scraped open, groaning. A sliver of gray, dusty light fell into the cellar. It was not morning. It was a dull, brown twilight. Eli pushed the door open, the heavy drift of sand and dirt sliding in. He climbed out, then reached down for her. She took his hand, and he pulled her up, out of the earth. The world was gone. It was not her land. It was a barren, alien place, scoured clean. The garden was gone, dug out of the earth. The chicken coop had vanished, leaving only a few splintered boards. The trough was buried. The fences were gone. She turned, her heart in her throat, and looked at the house. The wind had gotten under the new shingles Eli had laid. The north side of the roof was peeled back, open to the sky. The glass he had just set in the window was shattered, a black, gaping hole. It was too much. The confession, the storm, the ruin. She had survived. She had freed herself from Amos. She had fought the town. She had fought the land. And she had lost. The land had finally, truly, won. No, she whispered. It was not a plea. It was a statement of defeat. She stood in the middle of the ruined yard, the brown dust thick on her skin, in her hair. She looked at the sky, at the house, at the endless, empty dirt. She did not scream. She did not cry. She just broke. Her knees buckled. Her spine, which had been rigid for 3 years, gave way. She folded, sinking to the ground, her hands limp at her sides. It was over. She had nothing left. Eli stood, watching her. He saw the ruin. He saw the broken roof, the buried fences. He saw the work of months, wiped out in a single night. He walked over to her. She was on her knees, her head bowed, her body shaking in the cold, gray light. He did not speak. He did not offer words of comfort. There were none. He bent, slid one arm under her knees, the other around her back. He lifted her. She was light, a bundle of rags and dust. Her head fell against his shoulder, her face hidden. He held her for a moment, steadying himself. Then he began to walk. He walked past the buried garden. He walked past the gaping, broken window of the main room, her bedroom, which was now filled with dirt and open to the sky. He walked to the kitchen door. It was still shut. The bolt, on the inside, had held. The door was covered in a thick plaster of mud and dust, but it was standing. He kicked it. The wood slammed open, the bolt on the inside splintering from its catch. He stepped across the threshold, carrying her. He walked into her fortress. He walked into her prison. He stood in the center of the clean-scrubbed floor, in the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke and herbs. And he just held her, silent, as she finally wept. He set her down on the floor of her kitchen. The room was dark, the windows caked with a thick, brown plaster of mud, dust motes, heavy as snow, drifted in the single shaft of gray light coming from the splintered door frame. Clara did not move. She sat where he placed her, her hands limp in her lap, her body still bowed in the shape of her grief. She had wept until her eyes were dry, her throat raw. She was empty. The confession, which she had held inside her like a poisoned stone for 3 years, was out. She had laid her sin, her fear, and her freedom at his feet in the dark earth. And he had not run. He had held her. He had carried her. Now, he stood in the center of her forbidden room, his clothes stiff with dirt, his face a mask of exhaustion and grit. He looked at her, then at the room, the house, her world, was in ruins around them. The main room, her bedroom, was open to the sky, the floor a slurry of mud and splinters. This room, the kitchen, was all that was left. Eli did not speak. He did not offer comfort. The time for that was done. He walked to the cast-iron stove. He ran a hand over its cold surface. The storm, in its violent shaking, had dislodged the stovepipe. It hung at a crooked angle, a gap of black sky visible where it should have met the ceiling. He went outside. Clara heard him. A dull, thumping sound. He was salvaging. He came back minutes later with a piece of warped tin from the ruined chicken coop and his tools, which he had pulled from the mud. He began to work. Clara watched him, numb. He moved with a quiet, certain economy. His hands, caked with drying mud, were steady. He climbed onto the counter, his weight creaking the wood, and began to work the stovepipe back into place. He was strong. He was patient. He was just there. He was not her husband. He was not her judge. He was a man, fixing her stove. It took an hour. He fashioned a brace from the tin, securing the pipe. He checked the flue. He went back out and returned with an armload of splintered wood, the remnants of her fence, her corral. He laid them in the stove, added a twist of dry grass he'd found, and struck a match. The fire caught, a small, hungry flame. He closed the iron door, and the stove began to tick, a sound of warmth, of life. The heat, the first in what felt like a lifetime, seeped into the cold room. It touched Clara's skin. She looked at her hands. They were filthy, her nails broken. She thought of her confession. She thought of the bounty hunters. She thought of the ruin outside. And then she looked at the flour sack. It was half buried in debris near the pantry, but the canvas looked intact. She stood up, her legs shaking. She pulled the sack free, untied the top. Inside, the flour was dry. Eli stopped his work. He watched her. She found her water bucket. She went to the pump outside, and for 10 minutes, worked the handle, pumping the thick, gritty brown water until it finally ran clear. She filled the bucket. She came back inside. She found her wooden bowl, her salt tin. She poured flour into the bowl, her hands clumsy. She added water, salt, the last of her yeast. She began to mix. The dough was sticky. She turned it out onto the clean scrubbed table, the one he had placed her at. She began to knead. It was a resurrection. Her arms, which had felt leaden and useless, found their old rhythm. She pushed, folded, turned, push, fold, turn. She was covered in dirt, her hair a wild, matted tangle, and now she was covered in flour. She was weeping again, but this time there was no sound. The tears just tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She was kneading her confession, her fear, and her rage into the bread. She was punching the ghost of Amos, and the judgment of the town, and the violence of the storm, into something that could feed them. Eli sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and watched her. He watched her hands, her face. He watched her fight her way back to the world, one handful of dough at a time. When the loaf was shaped, she put it in a pan and set it by the stove to rise. They did not speak. They slept in the kitchen that night. The main room was uninhabitable. Eli laid his bedroll by the door, a silent guardian. Clara curled into her sewing chair, wrapped in a blanket. The stove ticked between them, a warm, iron heart. The next morning, she baked the bread. The smell, rich and yeasty, filled the small room, covering the scent of dust and ruin. It smelled of life. She took the bread from the oven, her hands shaking. She cut 2 thick, ragged slices. She handed one to him. Eli took it. They ate together, standing in the kitchen. In the gray morning light, it was their first meal. It was a communion. The days that followed were a blur of salvage. The homestead was a wasteland, but the kitchen was their base. They worked from sunup to sundown. They hauled debris from the main room. They found unbroken boards from the barn. Eli, with a grim determination, began to patch the gaping hole in the roof, using salvaged tin and pieces of the ruined wagon bed. Clara worked beside him. She was no longer the brittle, sharp-edged woman. The storm had scoured her clean, and the confession had set her free. She was quiet. She was weary, but she was present. They began to talk, not of the things that haunted them, not of the fire or the hanging. They spoke of small things. "My mother taught me to mend," she said one afternoon, her needle pulling thread through a torn shirt. She said a straight stitch was a sign of a steady mind. "My brother, Ben," Eli said, his voice quiet as he sanded a splintered board. "He was fond of sweets. He could eat a whole pie, if my mother let him." He was telling her his brother's name. She was telling him of her mother. They were handing each other the small, clean pieces of their past, leaving the bloody ones in the dark. The kitchen, once her prison, became their world. They ate every meal at the small table. He would clean his tools by the lamplight. She would read her mother's Bible, her lips moving silently. The touches began. He would hand her a hammer, his calloused fingers brushing her palm. She would not flinch. She would hand him a cup of coffee, and her hand would linger on the tin for just a second, sharing the warmth. One evening, she was at the stove, her back to him, stirring a pot of thin stew. She was tired, her shoulders aching. She felt him behind her, the heat of his body before he ever touched her. His hands settled on her shoulders, broad and heavy. He did not speak. He just held them, his thumbs pressed into the knots of her muscles, a firm, grounding pressure. Clara's breath caught. She leaned back, just a fraction, her head brushing his chest. She closed her eyes. It was the first simple, human comfort she had allowed herself in years. He held her there for a minute. Then his hands were gone. The stew bubbled. Neither of them spoke of it. But love, blooming in such a ruined, haunted place, was slow and fierce. It was a weed pushing up through hardpan. It was haunted by everything unspoken, by the ghost of Amos, the specter of his brother, and the reward for his capture. They needed supplies. The storm had taken nearly everything. They rode to Three Forks, not on the wagon, which was ruined, but both on horseback. Eli rode the gelding, and Clara rode Daisy. They rode into town together. The town stopped. It was one thing for the widow Foster to hire a drifter. It was another thing entirely for her to ride into town at his side, her face bare, her hair tied back, but soft. They looked like a man and a woman. Mr. Huxley, stocking shelves, just nodded, his eyes full of questions. Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, saw them from across the street. She stopped, her hand flying to her throat, her face a mask of pure, righteous condemnation. Clara met her gaze. She did not look away. She did not shrink. She held the woman's stare until Mrs. Davies turned, her black dress stiff, and marched into the church. They got their supplies. As they were tying the sacks to their saddles, a voice called out. Mrs. Foster. It was Sheriff Brody. He was not alone. Behind him were three men, including Silas, the man Eli had stared down. They looked nervous, but self-important. "Sheriff," Clara said, her voice steady. Eli did not move. He stood by his horse, his hands loose at his sides, his stillness a warning. "Ma'am," Brody said, his eyes on Eli. There is a difficult matter. Those bounty hunters were back. They spoke to the judge. They say they have proof this man, Eli Stone, is a fugitive, wanted for horse theft down in Texas. He told me," Clara said. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. He did? He did, and he told me he did not do it. He told me his brother was hanged for it. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice pained. That is a fine story, but the law is the law. They are riding to the county seat to get a federal warrant. They're accusing you, ma'am, of harboring a fugitive." Silas spoke up, his voice sneering. "That's right. Sheriff, she's been hiding him. Who knows what else they've been doing out there?" Eli took one step. Silas shut his mouth. "I am the law in this town," Brody said, trying to regain control. "And I am demanding you hand this man over, now, before those men get back, for your own good. Clara." Clara looked at the sheriff. She looked at Silas, his face full of petty, jealous spite. She looked at the other men, their eyes shifting, eager for a show. Then she looked at Eli, who stood tall and quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon, braced for whatever came. She stepped off the boardwalk. She stood in the dust, between the sheriff's horse and Eli. "No," she said. The street went silent. "What did you say, ma'am?" Brody asked, believing he had misheard. "I said no." Clara's voice was not loud, but it cut through the air. "This man, Eli, he stayed. He stayed through the flood, and he stayed through the storm. He pulled me from the cellar. He is rebuilding my home, a home this town was happy to let rot." She took a breath, and her next words were a blade. "He is the only decent man who has ever stepped foot inside my home." The words struck like a physical blow. It was a public damnation of Amos Foster. It was a rejection of the town, of their whispers, of their rules. Silas's jaw dropped. Sheriff Brody's face turned red. "Clara," the sheriff warned, his voice low, "you do not know what you are saying. You are distraught." "I have never been clearer in my life," she said. "Then you are a fool," he snapped, his patience gone. "I cannot arrest him without a warrant, not without a fight, and I do not want one, but I am telling you, when those men return, I will have that warrant, and I will be back. You have until then." He yanked his horse's head around, his face furious. "Come on!" He and his men rode away, leaving a cloud of judgment in the dust. Clara and Eli were left alone in the street. He looked at her. His face was... she could not read it. It was gratitude and fear and a deep, profound sorrow. "You should not have done that," he whispered. "Get the supplies! Eli!" she said, her voice shaking now that the danger had passed. "We are going home." That night, the kitchen was thick with tension. The rebuilt roof groaned in the wind. The threat was no longer a ghost. It was real. It had a name. It was riding from the county seat. They ate their stew in silence. Clara could not taste it. After, Eli stood up. He did not gather the plates. He went to the corner where his saddlebags and bedroll had been drying. He picked up the bedroll. Clara's heart stopped. "What are you doing?" "He was right," Eli said, his back to her. He tied the roll with a piece of twine. "I brought this to you. I brought Silas, the sheriff, the warrant. I am just like my brother. I bring trouble. I will not be the one who ruins what little peace you have found." He turned. His rifle was in his hand. He was going to leave. He was going to walk out into the night, to be hunted. He was doing it to save her. "No," she said. "Clara, you defended me. That is more than anyone has ever done. But I will not let them. I will not let them put your name next to mine." He started for the door. Clara ran. She got to the door first, slamming it shut, her back against the wood. "No, you cannot." "Get out of the way," he said, his voice rough. "This is not your choice." I am not letting you go," she said, her voice trembling. "I will not." He stopped, a foot from her. He was so tall, he blocked the lamplight. "They will come back," he said. "They will arrest you." "I do not care." "Clara." She stopped his words. She reached up, grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands, and pulled his face down to hers. She kissed him. It was not a soft kiss. It was desperate, a raw, clumsy collision of mouths. It was salt and dust and fear. It was no, it was stay, it was mine. He froze. For one long, agonizing second, he was still, his body rigid. Then, with a low groan that seemed torn from his soul, his rifle clattered to the floor. His arms came around her, pulling her off her feet, his hands tangling in her hair. He kissed her back, and it was the confession he had never spoken. It was his own story of loss and loneliness and the hanging tree. She was trembling. He was trembling. She pulled back, her forehead resting against his, their breath mingling. The lamplight was soft, the kitchen warm. "Stay," she whispered. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a longing that matched her own. This was her room, her sanctuary, the place she had reclaimed. She took his hand. She did not lead him to the ruined bedroom. That was Amos's grave. She pulled him toward the center of the kitchen. She sank to the floor, pulling him with her. In the soft lamplight, on the hard, clean-scrubbed floorboards, they came together. It was not a fire. It was not the passion she had read about in forbidden books. It was something deeper. It was survival. It was reclamation. It was two bodies, scarred and weary, clinging to each other in the dark. A silent promise not to be alone. It was his hands, rough from work, being gentle on her skin. It was her, opening her heart, her home, her body, not out of duty, but out of a fierce, terrifying, necessary choice. After, they lay tangled in a blanket she had pulled from her chair. The stove ticked. The wind moaned outside, but it could not get in. She was curled against his chest, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm beneath her ear. "I do not want to be alone anymore," she whispered into the darkness. She felt his hand stroke her hair, his fingers gentle. He was quiet for a long time. "You never were," he replied, his voice a low, rough rumble. "You just forgot." She slept for the first time in her life. She slept a deep, dreamless, protected sleep. She woke to the cold. The fire in the stove was dead. The kitchen was filled with the gray, empty light of dawn. She was alone. The blanket was pooled around her waist. The floor beside her was empty. "Eli?" She sat up, her heart seizing, a cold, sharp panic. The room was empty. His rifle was gone. "Eli!" She scrambled to her feet, pulling the blanket around her. She ran to the door. It was ajar, swinging slightly in the cold breeze. She threw it open. The yard was empty. The gelding was gone. His saddle was gone. He had left. After everything, after her confession, after their night, he had left her. The shame was a physical blow. He had taken what he wanted, and he had run. He was a thief, after all. He was just like Amos. She sank to her knees in the doorway, the cold air rushing in, her body numb. And then she saw it. It was on the porch step, sitting neatly, as if placed there for her to find. It was not his. It was dark, with a wide brim and a silver star pinned to the front. It was the sheriff's hat. She stared. It made no sense. She crawled forward, her hands shaking, and picked it up. It was real. He had not run from the sheriff. He had run to him. He had turned himself in. He had left his rifle, but taken the hat as what? A sign? A promise? No, he had taken the sheriff. He had surrendered. He had not run to save himself. He had run to save her, by sacrificing himself. Clara stood up, the sheriff's hat clutched in her hands, and stared. Not at the road he had taken, but at the open kitchen door behind her. The cold woke her. It was not the cold of the storm. It was the cold of absence. Clara sat up, her heart a block of ice in her chest. The kitchen was gray with the first sick light of dawn. The fire in the stove was dead. The blanket was pooled on the floor where she lay. But the space beside her, the space he had filled, was empty. His bedroll was gone. His rifle was gone. "Eli?" she whispered. She scrambled to her feet, the blanket falling away, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. "Eli!" She ran to the door, the splintered one he had kicked open. It was ajar, swaying slightly in the freezing wind. "No," she breathed. He had left. After everything. After the cellar. After the confession. After the night they had shared. He had run. The shame was a physical, sour taste. He was a thief. He was a liar. He was just like Amos. He had seen her weakness, taken what he wanted, and fled before the bounty hunters arrived. Mrs. Davies was right. Men like him do not stay. She stumbled onto the porch, her body numb, her eyes blind with tears of rage and a grief so profound it stole her breath. She was alone again. She was the town fool. She sank to the top step, the cold soaking through her thin clothes. It was over. And then she saw it. It was not his hat. It was sitting on the porch rail, dark and solid in the gray light. It was Sheriff Brody's hat, the one with the silver star. Clara stared. The world stopped. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the damp felt. He had not run from the law. The law had come here. In the dead of night, while she slept, the sheriff must have returned, perhaps with the bounty hunters. And Eli had met them. He had not run. He had surrendered. He had gone with them, quietly, leaving her to her sleep, leaving her safe from the accusation of harboring him. He had sacrificed himself. The hat was not a trophy. It was a sign. Left for her. It was the only way he could tell her what had happened. The ice in her chest shattered, replaced by a fire so hot it burned her lungs. It was a rage, but it was not the rage of a victim. It was the rage of a woman who had, for one night, known what it was to be safe. She was not the bitter widow. She was not the haunted woman. She was the woman Eli Stone had saved, and the woman who would, in turn, save him. She ran inside, her bare feet slapping the floor. She did not bother with the stove. She did not bother with coffee. She pulled on her muddy boots, threw her father's old oilskin coat over her shoulders, and ran to the pasture. Daisy, her mare, nickered, her breath pluming in the air. Clara saddled the horse with a speed she did not know she possessed. Her hands were raw, her body aching, but she felt nothing. She threw herself onto the mare's back and kicked her into a gallop, riding hard through the ruined landscape, toward Three Forks. The town was a pit of mud, the main street choked with debris from the storm, but it was buzzing. People were not clearing the wreckage. They were gathered, a dark cluster of bodies, outside the saloon. Clara rode Daisy straight into the crowd, men scattered, cursing. She pulled the mare to a rearing stop, her eyes scanning. They had turned the saloon into a makeshift courtroom. Through the grimy window, she saw him. Eli was standing in the center of the room, his hands bound in front of him. His face was caked with dirt, his hair wild. He was looking at the floor. Sheriff Brody was there, looking ashamed. The two bounty hunters were at a table, looking smug, and at the head of the room, at a table usually reserved for poker, sat a man in a traveling suit, a judge, Judge Harlan. Clara slid from the horse, leaving the reins to trail in the mud. She walked through the silent, parting crowd. They stared at her. The ruined woman, the widow who had taken in a fugitive. She did not see them. She shoved the saloon doors open. They banged against the walls, and the room went silent. Every head turned. Mrs. Davies was there, in the front row, her face a mask of judgment. Silas was there, grinning, eager for the show. Mr. Huxley was in the back, wringing his hands. Judge Harlan looked up, annoyed. This is a closed hearing, madam. Then Eli looked up. His head snapped toward the door. His eyes met hers, and his mask of indifference broke. It was not relief, it was terror. "Clara," he breathed. "No, get out." "I will not," Clara said. Her voice was low, but it filled the room. She walked forward, mud from her boots marking the floor, and stopped in the center, 10 feet from the judge, 10 feet from Eli. "This is Mrs. Foster," Sheriff Brody said, his voice heavy. The woman who owns the homestead." "I see," the judge said, his eyes narrowing. "Madam, this man is accused of being Eli Stone, a fugitive from Texas, wanted for horse theft. A serious charge. You have been accused of harboring him." "His name is Eli Stone," Clara said, her voice clear. "He is not a thief." The scarred bounty hunter laughed. "He is Judge. Stole Judge Thorne's prize stallion. There is a $100 reward. We have the papers." He slapped a piece of paper on the table. "He is not a thief," Clara repeated, her eyes on the judge. "And how would you know that, Mrs. Foster?" the judge asked, his voice laced with disdain. "What is this man to you?" Clara looked at Eli. He was shaking his head, begging her with his eyes to be silent. She turned back to the judge. "He is the man who rebuilt my fences. He is the man who fixed my roof. He is the man who pulled me from my root cellar when the storm hit and saved my life. He is a better man than anyone in this room." A gasp went through the crowd. Silas snickered. "He is a better man than Amos Foster?" The name hung in the air. Clara's hands clenched. "Yes," she said. "Mrs. Davies stood up. "Judge, this is indecent. This woman is unhinged. She was known to be a cold wife. The town knows what she is." "Sit down, Mrs. Davies," the judge said. He looked at Clara. "This is not a trial of his character. Mrs. Foster, it is a matter of law. He stole a horse." "He did not," Clara said. "His brother did." "No, that is not right. His brother was accused. A young man, Ben Stone. He was hanged for it, by a corrupt judge. Eli has been running ever since. Not from the law, from the memory." "A fine story," the bounty hunter said. "And I suppose he told you this? In the night, in your kitchen?" Clara looked him dead in the eye. "He told me, and I believe him, because I, too, know what it is to be judged by whispers. I know what it is to be called something you are not." She took a deep breath. "This was it. This was the true cost." "You all," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she had never possessed. "You all whisper. You have for 3 years. You called me the bitter widow. You called me cursed. You blamed me for my husband's death." "Clara, do not," Eli said, his voice a low plea. She ignored him. "You all thought my husband, Amos Foster, was a good man, a pillar of this town." She laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You were wrong. He was not a good man. Behind the doors of my home, he was a cruel man. He was a tyrant who used his fists and his voice to keep me a prisoner." The room was stone silent. "Mrs. Davies looked as if she had been slapped. "The night of the fire," Clara continued, her voice dropping. "He was drunk. He was in a rage. He came after me. He said he would send me to hell. He went to the barn, raving, carrying a lantern. I followed him." She paused. She could feel every eye on her, a weight of judgment that would have crushed her a week ago. Now, it was just air. "He stumbled in the hayloft. The lantern fell. The fire. It was so fast." "An accident, then," the judge said, leaning forward. Clara met his gaze. "He ran for the door, the big barn door. He ran for it, to escape. But he could not open it." "Why not?" the judge whispered. "Because it was bolted," Clara said, "from the outside." The silence in the room was absolute. A heavy, suffocating blanket. Someone, Mrs. Davies, let out a small, strangled sound. "And who," the judge said, his voice barely audible, "bolted the door?" Clara stood straight, her chin high. "I did. I was outside. I was terrified. He was coming for me. I did not know the lantern had fallen. I slid the bolt. I did not set the fire, but I did not save him from it." "She is a murderer! Mrs. Davies screamed, her voice cracking. "She killed him! She let him burn!" "She ought to hang!" Silas yelled. "Jail her! Judge! Jail them both!" The room exploded. Men were standing, shouting. Half the room looked at her with horror, the other half with a new, stunned understanding. Huxley, in the back, just looked at the floor, his face pale. Eli was straining against his ropes, his eyes closed, his face a mask of agony. "Clara, why?" "Order," the judge roared, slamming his fist on the table. "Order!" The room quieted, but the air was thick with hate and shock. "Judge," the scarred bounty hunter said, a thin smile on his face. "It seems we have two criminals here. My warrant is for the man. What you do with the woman is your business. Now, we will take our prisoner and our reward." "You will not," a new voice said. The voice was old and hard, and came from the back of the saloon. The crowd parted. An old man, his face like cured leather, stepped forward. He wore the clothes of a rancher, but one who had seen better days. "Who are you?" the judge demanded. "My name is Abner Hayes," the man said. "I used to run cattle down on the Brazos, near Judge Thorne's land." The bounty hunter's smiles vanished. "I am in town for supplies," Abner Hayes said, his eyes on Eli. "I heard the commotion. I heard the name Stone, and I heard the name Thorne." He spat on the floor. "Judge Thorne is a snake. He is the most corrupt man in Texas. I knew him. I knew his prize stallion. That horse was a demon, untamable, threw Thorne, broke his collarbone." He walked closer, his gaze softening as he looked at Eli. "And I knew Ben Stone. He was a good boy, sweet-tempered. He could calm any animal. Thorne hired him to break the stallion. When the boy could not, Thorne, he got angry. He accused the boy of theft, said he had lamed the horse. It was a lie. The whole town knew it was a lie. This is hearsay," the younger bounty hunter stammered. "It is the truth," Abner said, his voice like iron. "Thorne called for a hanging. I was there. I watched. I was a coward. I had land near his. I was afraid to speak up." He looked at Clara, his eyes full of a sudden, fierce respect. "I was afraid. But this woman is not." He turned back to the judge. "The warrant those men are carrying is poison. Judge, it is paper written by a murderer to hunt an innocent man. The boy, Ben, he died. This one, he has his brother's eyes. You let these men take him. You are no better than Thorne." Judge Harlan stared at Abner, then at the bounty hunters, then at Clara, and finally at Eli. He was a man trapped. The law was the law, but the truth was staring him in the face. He picked up the bounty hunter's paper. He looked at it. Then he tore it in half. "What?" the bounty hunter sputtered, lunging forward. "This is my jurisdiction," Harlan said, his voice cold. "And in this town, I hear testimony. I have the word of two bounty hunters, strangers chasing money. And I have the word of Abner Hayes, a man I have known for 20 years. And I have the word of this woman, who has just sacrificed her entire life to tell the truth. I find no cause to hold this man." He looked at the bounty hunters. "Your warrant is from a corrupt judge, in another territory. It has no power here. Get out of my saloon." "You cannot." "Get out," Harlan roared, "before I have Sheriff Brody arrest you for disturbing the peace." The bounty hunters stared. their faces purple with rage. They looked at Abner Hayes, who had not moved. They looked at the sheriff, whose hand was now on his gun. Cursing, they grabbed their hats and stormed out of the saloon, shoving their way through the crowd. Judge Harlan looked at Eli. "Sheriff, cut him loose." Brody, his face full of a complex relief, hurried to cut Eli's ropes. Then the judge looked at Clara. The room was silent, waiting. "Mrs. Foster," he said, his voice heavy. "What you have confessed. It is a terrible thing. The fire was 3 years ago. It was ruled an accident by my predecessor. Your statement today. It is a matter for your conscience and for your God. It is not a matter for this court. You are free to go." Eli was free. He rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Clara did not cry. She did not smile. She just stood. She felt light. The stone was gone. She turned. The crowd parted for her, a silent, shuffling wave. She heard the whispers. "Murderer." She let him burn. "Witch." "Crazy." Mrs. Davies was standing by the door, her face pale, her hands clutched. As Clara passed, the woman whispered, You will burn for this." Clara stopped. She looked at the preacher's wife. "Maybe I will, Mrs. Davies," she said, her voice clear and calm. "But I will no longer be cold." She walked out of the saloon, into the bright, clean, ruined day. A moment later, Eli was beside her. He did not touch her. He just stood at her side, a solid, quiet presence. She did not shrink. She did not look at the ground. She kept her chin high. They could whisper. They could call her anything they wanted. They were just words. They could not bolt doors. They could not haunt her. She was free. They walked to the horses. Abner Hayes was there. He nodded to Eli. "You take care of her. Son, she is quite a woman." "I will," Eli said, his voice hoarse. They mounted. They rode out of Three Forks, side by side, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them. They rebuilt. The land was still hard. The work was endless, but it was not a fight anymore. It was just work. Eli was a phantom no longer. He was solid. He was present. He did not just fix the roof. He taught her how to measure and cut the boards herself. They worked as partners. They tilled the garden, planting new seeds in the storm-scoured earth. The stray dog, Patch, healed and strong, slept on the porch, a silent, happy guardian. The kitchen, the room he had once been forbidden to enter, became the heart of their world. It was no longer a prison. It was a home. It filled with sounds Clara had not heard in years. The sound of two people talking, the sound of Eli, his voice low and hesitant, telling her about Ben. The sound of her voice soft, telling him about her mother. One night, Eli was mending a broken chair leg. He was frowning, his tongue stuck out in concentration. Clara, watching him, let out a small, rusty sound, a laugh. Eli looked up. Startled, a slow, spreading smile transformed his face. The scar on his cheek crinkled. He smiled, and the kitchen was filled with light. Winter came, but the house was warm. The roof held. The kitchen was always full of the smell of baking bread or simmering stew. One late afternoon, the snow falling soft and thick outside. Clara was at the table. Her hands were deep in a cloud of flour, kneading dough. She pushed, folded, and turned, the familiar rhythm a comfort. She heard him come in, his boots soft on the floor. He had been clearing snow from the animal's trough. He did not speak. He walked up behind her. She felt the heat of him. His arms came around her waist, his hands settling over hers, flour-dusted and strong. He pulled her back against his chest, resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, in the warm, yeasty-smelling kitchen. The only sound the ticking of the stove and the whisper of the snow. Clara stopped kneading. She leaned her head back, resting against him. She was home. She turned her head, her cheek brushing the rough wool of his shirt, and met his eyes. His gray eyes, no longer haunted, were full of a quiet, steady warmth. She smiled, her own eyes bright. "This is yours too now," she said softly. He did not answer with words. He just tightened his arms around her, lowered his head, and kissed her, slow and deep, tasting of flower, and winter, and all the days to come. The land was still hard. The world outside was still cruel. But here, in this small, warm kitchen, love, fragile, defiant, and finally safe, had found a home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and please share your thoughts with us in English